Denise Scott Brown and Zaha Hadid are two of the most celebrated architects of the last half-century. They would not immediately appear to have much in common besides being two of the few women to have achieved that status. Scott Brown is one of the most important theorists of postmodern architecture. She is best known perhaps for her advocacy of what she calls decorated sheds rather than ducts, and for her championing of, in her words, the ugly and ordinary. Nearly 2 decades, Scott Brown's junior, Hadid first achieved fame as an apostle of deconstructivism. More recently, her parametric approach has resulted in something like the revival of the late modernist duct, albeit in ways that have only been buildable since the onset of digital design, which she consistently pushed to new limits. Here I show you her port house in Antwerp, completed shortly after her death. Biography is out of fashion as a means of writing architectural history. But when it comes to understanding how some women are able to be influential in the teeth of discrimination and even harassment, it can still be a useful tool. Among the many things Scott Brown and Hadid shared were privileged upbringings on the fringes of the British Empire, educations that included the Architectural Association in London, careers initially defined more by teaching than by building, famously difficult temperaments, and somewhat belated recognition as crucial role models. They also exploited, although in very different ways, the way in which their habitats, to use Pierre Bourdieu's term, as women, raised to believe that architecture and design were appropriate domains for women, equipped them to cut across the grain of modernist theory and understand how architecture could be used to construct identity. A number of the 20th century's most celebrated architects, as I've said earlier, including Eric Mendelssohn and Louis Kahn, came from very modest, even impoverished backgrounds. But as I've also said earlier, this is not true for women architects of the past. I hope it is for those of the present and going future of the present, that architecture is open equitably to all. But women architects have historically come from quite economically privileged situations, and that was certainly true of these two. They came from prosperous families who were on the move. Scott Brown was born Denise Lakovsky in Nakana, a copper malleon town you see at the bottom in what was then northern Rhodesia and is today Zambia. Located close to the border with the Belgian Congo, now the Congo, Nakana is now part of the city of Kitwe, itself founded only in 1936 after the Lakovskys had decamped to Johannesburg, in part because of worries about young Denise's health. Mining is not environmentally beneficial activity. Her parents came from what is now South Africa in the case of her father, and Zimbabwe in that of her mother, to which their parents had moved from Tsarist Russia, from what's now Lithuania. Hadid's family were originally from Mosul in Iraq and moved to Baghdad, which I show you in her youth at the top, only after it became the capital of Iraq, a country formed after World War I from 3 former Ottoman provinces. Her mother's family had been very important in Mosul. The badges of family prosperity, and to some degree also of progressive politics, included the houses in which the two future architects grew up. Scott Brown's mother, Phyllis Hupker Lakovsky, commissioned this house from Norman Hansen, her former classmate at the architecture school of the University of Witwatersrand, the program in which her daughter would later enroll. Here, the Lakovskys, so this is Denise Scott Brown's mother's house. Here, the Lakovskys welcomed a wide variety of intellectuals as well as fellow Jews, fleeing far more terrifying persecution than the programs that had prompted their own parents to leave what's now Latvia, actually, as well as Lithuania. Hupker Lakovsky had not finished her own university degree because she ran out of money. Hers was one of the first houses in sub-Saharan Africa to display the obvious influence of Le Corbusier and Walter Gropius. Gropius's own house in Lincoln, Massachusetts, of which this may remind you was designed only afterwards. Its architects, Norman Hansen in particular, its architect had been to Europe where he had seen the work of Le Corbusier and Gropius for himself. One of the most respected South African architects of his generation, he eventually left the country to teach at the University of Manchester. Scott Brown grew up assuming that architecture was an appropriate field for women and familiar with cutting-edge design. She said of the house in a 1990 interview, "I don't have the sentimental memories of the attic and the steps up to the attic and the oak paneling. What I have is strip windows, which have walls that don't quite come up to the window, and there's a little piece between that you can peep through and listen through. I have mild steel columns that are pilotis that you can climb up, and a fantastic deck which came out like the deck of a ship, with a spiral stair coming down to the ground floor where I could play shop, and we could climb up on the roof and play on the flat roof of this house." The house in which Hadid grew up had, in the 1930s, been as much of a showpiece of modern architecture in Baghdad as the Lakhovsky house was in Johannesburg. I thank Amin Al-Sadin for his help in locating information about it. I have not yet located a good photograph of it. You do see Hadid probably in it at the top as a girl, and at the bottom, a Baghdadi house of about the same date by the same Syrian architect, in this case for the family of one of Hadid's father's closest political associates and sometimes rivals, who was also the father of Rifat Chaudhry, the most important Baghdad-based architect of the next generation. Although this house is arguably more Art Deco than International style, it is representative of the popularity that a clear break with the past had with progressively minded elites across the Middle East, Asia, and indeed also Latin America already in the 1930s. Hadid's father was representative of this group. His mother and his wife came from two of Mosul's wealthiest and most powerful families. Educated at the London School of Economics, where he was attracted to Fabian socialism, Mohammed Hadid was for many years a leading advocate of democracy in Iraq, although he also participated as finance minister in the government named after a bloody coup in 1958. For his daughter, architecture was both an appropriate profession for women and a means of expressing modernity. In an interview, she remembered that in Iraq there had been many women architects, and the impact upon her when she was 6 of watching the architect of a house her aunt was building in Mosul present drawings and models of it. She also recalled, "I used to draw a lot, and my father knew many architects. They used to come and visit us. If you think back, there was incredible development and new ideas in the 60s. It was when they built Brasilia. And there was another issue, too. In South America and the Middle East, architecture began to represent a new era, a new level of independence, and move away from colonialism to modernity. We had Gropius building the university campus. There was a lot going on." The university, by the way, was officially the work of the Architects Collaborative, 2 of whose 8 founding partners were women. Scott Brown and Hadid were born far from the cities in Europe and the United States in which modernism was forged. But Johannesburg and Baghdad were also places where historical and historicist buildings were not as important as they were in most of Europe. Johannesburg was established as a mixed-race settlement only half a century before Scott Brown's family moved there. Hadid's hometown, Baghdad, was a much older city, of course, but its population roughly quadrupled in the 2 decades following her birth in 1950. Both architects, in consequence, approached modernism in ways that were very different from the Europeans who associated it, not necessarily accurately, with socialist politics between the wars and Reconstruction afterwards. Although neither Scott Brown nor Hadid had access growing up to buildings as skilled and subtle as the best recent work of the starchitects of the day, they experienced modernism as the backdrop to daily life. Moreover, their privileged social positions were supported by the presence of servants, meaning that even as children they grew up used to commanding others. Nonetheless, from an early age, they must have been acutely aware of cultural and political difference. Although Scott Brown was Jewish and Hadid Muslim, they attended academically rigorous and socially prestigious church-run schools, Anglican in Scott Brown's case and Catholic in Hadid's. Mohammed Hadid was usually in opposition to governments he regarded as insufficiently independent of British influence, while the Lakhovskys, like many South African Jews, did not support the imposition of apartheid in 1948, or I should say like most South African Jews. These experiences informed the positions the 2 women took as architects. Increasing attention is now being paid, for instance, to the South African roots of Scott Brown's predilection for pop, which significantly preceded her exposure to the independent group once she arrived in London. She has written of her youth, and These are photographs of South Africa by Constance Stewart Larrabee. This is one of Scott Brown's early photographs, and up at the top is a photograph republished by Bernard Lekowski's of Dogon architecture in Mali from his book Architecture Without Architects. She's written of her youth. Our racial conflicts degraded and dishonored us all, but the clash had another dimension. For me, African folk artists' adaptations of Johannesburg outstrip European artists' interpretations of Africa, interesting though these are. Debased, quote unquote, African folk pop was an inspiration for our study of roadside America. So this is what she's talking about. Notice how far removed the Africa she experienced growing up, shown here in photographs by Constance Stewart Larrabee, as well as Scott Brown herself, was from the African architecture at the top there, fawned over in the 1950s and 60s by Aldo van Eyck and Bernard Brodowski. They turned to African and other so-called primitive cultures for supposed authenticity that they believed the Industrial Revolution, and very specifically its commercialism rather than industry and engineering, had destroyed. Scott Brown, on the other hand, believed in the modernity of black Africans and understood that they had the same rights to fashionable clothes and urban space that she did. Having accepted this for them, she could also allow that working and middle-class Americans, whether or not their taste agreed with her own, should not be dismissed out of hand with the air of cultured superiority that characterized, for instance, Peter Blake's book, God's Own Junkyard, The Planned Deterioration of the American Landscape, published in 1964, at just the time she was discovering Las Vegas. Scott Brown's, the recommendation I might add of her parents, Scott Brown's experiences growing up in an increasingly racially divided society left her with a respect for the taste of the less privileged, which was unusual at a time when advocates of modern architecture tended to espouse it as the expression of the power of the masses, but use it to define their own cultural sophistication. Scott Brown arrived at the Architectural Association on Bedford Square in 1952, Hadid exactly 20 years later. It is not clear whether either knew that the surrounds of the doors they entered for the next phase of their education had been manufactured by Britain's most successful 18th century businesswoman, Eleanor Code. No matter. Here they acquired the tools they needed to become among the most influential architects of their time. Growing up in modernist showpieces and with female relatives who commissioned innovative houses was certainly empowering, but so was having the means to travel. Scott Brown made her first visit to Europe already in the 1930s, in other words, before she turned 10. Hadid attended boarding schools in England and Switzerland and earned her undergraduate degree from the American University in Beirut. Mobility, as I've said before, is too often overlooked as a crucial factor for the careers of successful women artists and architects. In a famous essay written in Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists, by pointing to the impossibility of respectable women studying the nude figure, but the ability to travel has been at least of equal importance. Consider these two paintings. Both feature portraits of Eleonora de' Medici, Duchess of Mantua. Lavinia Fontana here shows the Duchess as Queen of Sheba in a visit made to Bologna on the way back from witnessing her sister Marie's proxy wedding to the King of France, an event that took place in Florence in 1600. And this painting, of course, is one of the glories of the National Gallery of Ireland. One of the witnesses to that occasion was the young Flemish painter Peter Paul Rubens, then at the court of Eleanor's husband, who would eventually include the wedding in the cycle of paintings he made a generation later for Marie, which are now in the Louvre in Paris. Perhaps Rubens was more innately talented than Fontana, but his gender also gave him opportunities she did not have. His travels across Europe followed the networks established by female members of the Habsburg dynasty. Mobility was at this time the province of high-born women like Eleanor and Marie, and of men like Rubens who served them. But it was not accessible to Fontana, although she came from nearly as elevated a social position as Rubens. Her father Prospero had worked in Rome and Fontainebleau, as well as his native Bologna. In addition to his daughter, his students included Ludovico and Agostina Carracci, who roamed much of the Italian peninsula, seeing for themselves the best Roman and Venetian paintings, two traditions that they successfully fused. Fontana, however, stayed home until 1603, when the by now middle-aged artist respectively married and the mother of 11 children belatedly moved to Rome at the request of the Pope. Moving from South Africa to London to Philadelphia in Scott Brown's case, and from Baghdad to London in Hadid's, took them to the places that fostered the theoretical discourse about the architecture they had grown up taking for granted. It also wrenched them away from the gendered conventions of the cultures into which they were born, while leaving them relatively independent of those of their adopted homelands, in which they remained slightly alien. And it left them unusually adept at working in cultural contexts outside of those typical for the architects who had trained beside them in London, or in Scott Brown's case, also in Philadelphia. From the AA, Scott Brown traveled with her first husband in 1956 to the United States, where they enrolled at the University of Pennsylvania. Widowed after his death in a car crash, she completed her degree and began to teach at Penn. In 1965, she headed west to Berkeley and UCLA. Along the way, she stopped in Las Vegas. The following year, she invited her former colleague, Robert Venturi, to Los Angeles to be a guest critic and took him as well to Las Vegas. In 1967, the pair married, and Scott Brown returned to Philadelphia to join his practice. Her professional breakthrough came in 1972 with the publication of Learning from Las Vegas based on a studio they had team taught at Yale. In addition to displaying her fascination with the ugly and ordinary, the book also bore the clear imprint of her writing skills. Robert Venturi is a man of many talents, but clear writing is not one of them. While most of the other American architects to whom the postmodernist label is frequently assigned eschewed social engagement, Scott Brown has always insisted not only on understanding the way in which architecture conveys meaning, but also acknowledged and respected the social context in which this happens. Her sensitivity to race manifested itself in her participation in the campaign to prevent the construction of a motorway down Philadelphia's South Street that would have created a barrier between a black neighborhood to the south and the more prosperous, largely white city to the north. Her close observation of the contemporary American vernacular can also be seen in the 1976 exhibition, Signs of Life, Symbols of the American City, at Washington's Renwick Gallery, which she curated with Stephen Eisenhower, who served as the exhibit designer. The labels argued that people are more interested in representing their ideals and aspirations through architecture than they are in noticing how well a building expresses its structure and function. That is a really radical declaration for 1976. This argument was buttressed by thoughtful analyses of what the critic Ada Louise Huxtable, in a rave review published in the New York Times, termed a revealing picture of today's aesthetic standards that has everything to do with what is and little to do with what anyone thinks it should be. Scott Brown built her career around her ability to take the ordinary seriously and to decode the messages it communicated to those far removed from architectural culture. Some of the skills this required undoubtedly came from being an outsider who did not take row houses like the ones that clustered near South Street, nor the ways in which their interiors were decorated for granted. These houses were as likely to be inhabited by African American as Polish or Italian American families. It also indicated an almost uncanny ability to understand how women without her highly tuned sense of irony or her top-drawer professional training used their culturally sanctioned role in choosing where their families lived. Scott Brown acknowledged that they furnished their homes to say something about who they were and what they valued. In taking their choices seriously, she accorded them real respect. This was an unusual position for an American intellectual in the 1970s, when the specter of the so-called silent majority's support for the Vietnam War still hung over the American left, but it did not deter Scott Brown. The sympathetic Huxtable concluded, "This is the kind of show that changes the way you look at the world." But most of the architectural profession, including others who would be termed postmodernists, remained appalled. In 1976, the connection between this position and female experience went unarticulated except in Huxtable's review, which noted the relationship between the most genteel of the exhibited interiors and the pages of House Beautiful. edited by a series of influential women, including Atlhough, the partner of pioneering American architect Eleanor Raymond, and Elizabeth Gordon, who famously backed Edith Farnsworth over Ludwig Mies van der Rohe for most of the period between 1913 to 1969, although less consistently since. This is one of many magazines that target women as consumers of interior design as much as architecture. Although, as Gordon's Cold War-infused condemnation of Mies made clear, the shelter press seldom backed cutting-edge design, it has, in addition to employing female editors and journalists, encouraged middle-class women around the world to view themselves as knowledgeable about an area in which they were often able to assert considerable agency in their own lives. After the publication of Learning from Las Vegas established her as one of the most original and influential architectural theorists in the English-speaking world, it would take time for the book to have a readership elsewhere, Scott Brown struggled to achieve similar recognition for her design work. Her name appeared at the top of the firm only in 1980. In 1989, she published her famous essay, Room at the Top, Sexism and the Star System in Architecture, in which she detailed the degree to which her husband had received credit for her contributions and the outright sexism she had faced. This made her a feminist icon, a status that was only enhanced when Venturi won the Pritzker Prize when after he won the Pritzker Prize in 1991, she declined to attend the awards ceremony, and again when a grassroots campaign failed to get her the Pritzker, but did result in changes to the American Institute of Architects Gold Medal that led to her and Venturi receiving it jointly in 2016. Two of the campaigners, Harvard students who campaigned for that. Fame, if not opportunities to build, came more quickly to Hadid. After working briefly for Rem Koolhaas, she established her own practice in 1980 when she was only 30, more than a decade younger than Scott Brown had been when Learning from Las Vegas was published. Her victory in the Hong Kong Peak competition in 1983, which you see at the bottom, quickly established her as among the world's most formidable and original design talents. It would take more than another decade, however, before she completed the building, the Vitras Fire Station in Weil am Rhein in Germany. Through the 1980s and well into the 1990s, she relied upon teaching and lecture gigs in order to support herself in her fledgling practice. When success came, she found it abroad. The sad saga of the Cardiff Bay Opera House competition, which began in 1994, demonstrates the hostility that she faced in Britain. Nearly 20 years after she won the first of 3 rounds, she triumphed in the second and third as well. She was not sure whether what she termed the resistance and prejudice she had faced had been because she was a woman or because she was a foreigner. She had no major work in Britain until the Glasgow Museum of Transport opened in 2011, and in England until the completion of the Aquatic Centre for the London Olympics the following year. Scott Brown and Hadid faced similar hostility, exacerbated in Hadid's case undoubtedly by the fact that she was an Arab Muslim, long after she obtained British citizenship and indeed was awarded the OBE. Newspapers there typically described her as Iraqi. But they addressed them from very different personal situations. Scott Brown both benefited and suffered from being married to one of the most heralded and scorned architects of her generation. Across the 20th century and into our own, most successful women architects have been married to their professional partners. Hadid, however, remained single and for all public purposes unattached. Lacking a man at the helm to reassure nervous clients, she was slow to build, despite being one of the most talked about architects in the profession. Once she finally did begin to receive major commissions, however, her single status played in her favor, leaving her in control of her own image, even after her practice expanded to a scale in which she was no longer responsible for the details of each and every project. Her office is now the 3rd largest architectural practice in the UK. So it eventually far surpassed Venturi Scott Brown in size, but despite the key role that Patrick Schumacher played in it, it was far less openly collaborative. Moreover, being childless enabled her to be constantly on the move. Scott Brown, by contrast, was for a long time more tethered to Philadelphia, where in the 70s and 80s she had a son to help raise. Denied substantive commissions in Britain, Hadid depended in the first decade of this century for work upon 3 quite different constituencies outside it. All were, and I quote, people who are more interested in representing their ideals and aspirations through architecture than they are in noticing how well a building expresses its structure and function. Those, of course, are Huxtable's words in relationship to Scott Brown's exhibition. Although these, those are Scott Brown's exhibit labels. Although these ideals and aspirations were now more typically conditioned by attentiveness to public relations and corporate identity than Scott Brown could have foreseen when she addressed American domesticity in 1976. The first included European clients in search of imaginative visions of the new. Companies like Volkswagen, which funded the Phanos BMW, for which she built an administration building in Leipzig in Germany, as well as the founders of the Maxi, which you see at the top, a National Museum of Contemporary Art in Rome, turned to Hadid, much as the Vitra already had, to advertise their ability to stay atop art and design trends. This happened at precisely the time when Muslim culture, and particularly its supposed treatment of women, was being widely disparaged in Germany. Hiring Hadid was not necessarily an expression of support for multiculturalism, but it did have the added benefit of bestowing an air of cosmopolitanism upon clients seeking global brand recognition. The second group were attracted to Hadid specifically because she was an Arab woman, and she understood the desire of wealthy Middle Eastern and Chinese clients for landmarks that communicated newly achieved modernity at home and abroad. She proved extremely effective at working across cultures, but there were also cases when Muslims clearly cherished bestowing opportunities on one of their own. Furthermore, she understood what they wanted. For instance, on the office website, this bridge, the Sheikh Zayed Bridge, is described as being, and I quote, intended to serve as a catalyst for further growth in Abu Dhabi. While at the Haider Aliyev Center at the top, it says, the center, designed to become the primary building for the nation's cultural programs, breaks from the rigid and often monumental Soviet architecture that is so prevalent in Baku, inspiring instead to express the sensibilities of Azeri, meaning Azerbaijan, culture and the optimism of a nation that looks to the future. Such marketing language masks the conditions of production of these buildings, with allegations of human trafficking and other human rights abuses surrounding the construction industry in both cities. The final constituency was the fashion industry. Piers Gow, a juror on the committee that awarded the Haider Aliyev Center at the top the Design of the Year from London's Design Museum, described it as being, and I don't think this is language that people use to describe Frank Gehry's work, as pure and sexy as Marilyn's blown skirt. This is clearly sexist, but in the final years of her career, Hadid willingly exploited, look at that handbag, the relationship between fashion and architecture, so often used to trivialize women's accomplishments to her advantage. It helped, of course, that she epitomized the star system that Scott Brown scorned. Often described as a diva, a term, of course, that is never applied to men, she also garnered attention in ways that were uniquely available to her as a woman, without ever appearing sexual or submissive. Fashion became a means to both build her own brand and to get work. Posing for fashion shoots, being profiled in women's magazines, designing shoes, and working with companies like Chanel and Louis Vuitton helped offset the blatant sexism that characterized much of the writing and gossip about her. Hadid's effectiveness as a fashion icon was enhanced by the fact that she clearly enjoyed clothes. Although she favored skirts and tunics over leggings to pants, very few of her outfits were in any way feminine or conventionally revealing. Instead, they often appeared to operate as shields, celebrating her engagement with avant-garde design while floating relatively free of her actual body. They thus announced her talent while denying her availability. In comparison, Scott Brown was self-consciously ordinary, even slightly prim. Fashion matters, not because these women's achievements should or indeed can be reduced to the clothes that they wore, but because women schooled to make decisions about self-presentation through dress have also often made decisions about the appearance of interiors and gardens, about what kind of house to buy or build, about the buildings, including public libraries like the two I show here, hospitals, schools, and churches where their participation has long been sanctioned, and in other less gender-constrained circumstances as well, as in the case of what was originally South America's tallest building, and the tallest building in reinforced concrete in the world when it was finished in 1936, commissioned by an Irish-Argentinian, Karina Kavanaugh. While these possibilities have always been inscribed by class, they are real even if too many historians, like the male architects whose careers they validate, have been reluctant to assign agency to women who wielded real authority. Scott Brown and Hadid grew up in families where modernism was simultaneously an expression of social and economic status and of progressive politics. From societies in which class trumped gender, they further expanded their horizons by building careers abroad. Their self-consciousness about the way in which consumerism encouraged many women of their own and previous generations to construct identities through dress and design assisted them in carving out spaces for personal emancipation through creative expression. The challenge before us as historians is to recover the contributions many less celebrated women, including Scott Brown's mother and Hadid's aunt, have long made to architectural culture. As people, however, it is to empower those who lack the privilege required to launch Scott Brown and Hadid, and to build the relationship between architecture and substantive political change they shrewdly realized had been much exaggerated. The relationship to real social change that Martin Luther King called for in the I've Been to the Mountaintop speech.